Welcome to the Brave Woman at Work podcast. This is your host, Jen Pasticas. I'm so glad you're here. With the Brave Woman at Work podcast, you'll get the resources and tips along with real-world stories and humor to empower and inspire you to take bolder and braver actions in your career and life. Woman at Work podcast. This is your host, Jen Pasticas. I'm so glad you're here. Well, hey everyone, how are you doing out there? So here's a quick personal update, besides being sick, by the way, and thank you for your understanding of my voice. So recently, and I think this is probably what got me sick, is that I have been on a whirlwind tour on two very different trips. So first off, I was privileged enough to go to Paris for a few days, and then I went with my husband, by the way, and then I came home for a day in between, a day or two, to get the girls ready for school. And this was kind of poor planning on my part. I was off to Montana with friends, and you're going to hear a special kind of summer vacation episode with one of my dear friends, Pam Fierst Walsh, coming up here in a few weeks. And so I just want to tell you what I've been up to, and that, yes, I am so very blessed that I got to do that. And so be on the lookout for that other special summer podcast episode. And there'll be more to come on maybe some of my key takeaways. I'm thinking about doing a birthday episode. It's my birthday's coming up in the month of September, and thinking about taking some takeaways from this last year that I would like to share with you. But one of my key messages for you today, especially on the heels of these two trips, is that I just wanted to remind you that it is okay for you to take a break. So, quick reminder that you're not a bad mom, a wife, a boss, employee, sister, aunt, friend, or any other role in your life. If you want to drop off the grid for a while, and yes, I admittedly felt about a bit of guilt, right? I'm like, man, I was gone from my kids, and then I was gone from my kids again. But then I realized something, that I'm better in all areas of my life, all the areas, when I take breaks. And I also, dropped some balls, like while I was at it. I was out of pocket, like in different places for almost like 2.5 weeks. And so I had to pick those balls back up when I got back. I said, hey, I'm back. I'm sorry for this gap or that gap. And just kept on, keeping on. And the world kept moving without me while I was off the grid. So if you needed to hear this and you need to take a break, I'm going to just give you the permission, not that you need it, but I'm just going to give you the permission slip to say, take that break, right? Take a break before the end of the year. Don't let your vacation time or your PTO, paid time off, roll over, or, basically you use it or lose it, whatever your situation is in your work. Take that vacation and take that break. So I hope that message helps you. So, as my guest today, Dr. Angela Jackson says, it's a win-win. Win-win is a traditional corporate term. You either hear win-win or win-win-win, but Dr. Angela takes it to a whole new level. In her New York Times bestselling book, The Win-Win Workplace: How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Success, she shares 9 key principles that will drive the future of work. And I found this conversation so inspiring, and I'm sure you will too. So during the podcast, Dr. Angela and I chatted about why traditional top-down authority and decision-making will not work moving forward, the key mistakes leaders and companies make when trying to enhance employee productivity, an overview. So we dove in just like top level of the 9 key strategies that emerged from Dr. Angela's research for her book, how leaders can empower employees to make powerful decisions, the impact of creating a psychologically safe work environment on employees, and what advice Dr. Angela would have for any companies, teams, or leaders that are resistant to change. So here is more about Dr. Angela. Dr. Angela Jackson is the founder of Future Forward Strategies, a labor market intelligence, design thinking, and strategy firm that assists leaders with transforming organizations and human capital infrastructure necessary for public, private, and nonprofit organizations to maintain competitiveness while creating positive impact. Dr. Jackson is also a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she teaches the next generation of students about entrepreneurship in the education marketplace. Dr. Angela Jackson is also an expert in impact investing in environmental, social, and corporate governance, also known as ESG. As a leading voice on the future of work, Dr. Jackson has a deep knowledge of the technology trends that are transforming organizations and the human capital infrastructure necessary to ensure long-term profitability and sustainability. Also, as a managing partner at New Profit, a Boston-based venture philanthropy company, she was the architect of the Future of Work Grand Challenge, an initiative that reskilled 25,000 workers impacted by COVID-19 and placed them in living wage jobs and resulted in the development of an innovation ecosystem of over 60 employers, foundations, and education operating partners. She is an advisor to Guild Education, Freedom Learning Group, and the Education Design Lab, and serves on the boards of Beyond 12 and Summer Search. Dr. Jackson is passionate about modernizing the public education to employment system and advancing academic and professional opportunities for women, people of color, and veterans. Her work and writing have been featured in CNN, Forbes, Fortune, Huffington Post, Newsweek, Stanford Social Innovation Review, and Harvard Business Review. So I am so excited to have her on the show. And like I say every week, if the Brave Woman at Work podcast has helped you personally or professionally, please make sure to share it with a family member, friend, or colleague. And those ratings and reviews, they help the show continue to gain traction and grow. As I said in a future show that we just recorded today, we're getting really close to about 100,000 downloads. So that is so amazing. So I am so humbled and grateful that this show is getting in the hands of people, women, just listeners worldwide. So far, about 34 countries across the globe, and just inching towards 100,000 downloads. So if you are a longtime listener, you've just listened first time this week, and you've left a rating and review, or if you're about to, I just thank you. I appreciate all of the encouragement that you give to me so that I can continue to build a solid podcast for you. Also, if you haven't yet downloaded any of the freebies from my website, check them out at bravewomenatwork.com. The three freebies are 24 career and leadership affirmations, 5 ways to managing your imposter syndrome, and getting paid, 10 negotiation tips. Finally, we also have 1 to 2 spots still available for our upcoming book, Brave Women at Work, Lessons in Authenticity. If you have a dream of becoming a published author, I want you to look no further, sincerely. So my colleague and partner, Hope Mueller of Hunter Street Press, and I we kind of shepherd you step by step through the 9-month writing process. So the first few months are the writing, and then the back end of it is the marketing and our aim for Amazon bestseller. The best part of all of it is you do not need to be a professional writer. You simply need to have a dream of becoming an author in your heart and a story of authenticity. If you would like to learn more, please email me at hello@bravewomenatwork.com. Okay, let's welcome Dr. Angela to the show. Well, hello, Dr. Angela. How are you today? Welcome to Brave Women at Work.
Hey, Jen, I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, of course. So we just found out while we were hitting before record that Angela grew up like in my hood, right? She grew up like right out of the Chicago area, and now she's in Boston. I've been to Boston twice this year already, Angela. I didn't tell you that. And I drove one day to Salem. I had to see what was all the witchy woo about. That was really fun. And now I need to go back again so I can go visit Maine. So you're giving me all the places to visit. So thank you.
You have to. That's one thing I love about living in Boston. It's like living in a history book, like all the things that we learned, in third and fifth grade history about
Yeah.
how the country was founded. You can actually see those places here.
Yeah, no, that is so cool. So you've told us, okay, you told me before we hit record, okay, you were a Chicagoan and then you went out to California. Now you're an East Coaster. So tell us a little bit more about your background. You can start anywhere you want. I know this is a big question and how you've gotten to where you are today.
Yeah, a couple of things. When I think about my background and really became the why I began to watch this book is that I grew up in the Midwest, and Jen, you can appreciate this. It wasn't very diverse when I grew up at
Hmm.
all. And one thing that happened with me is that when I left the Midwest, I started my career in the private sector. I worked for Viacom, I worked for
Mm,
Nokia domestically and internationally. I began to travel a lot outside the US and travel a lot throughout the country. And I really started to really think of this idea like, what is the purpose of work in your life? And I grew up in, outside of Gurnee, a bit of a factory town. My grandfather at the time worked for American Motors, Chrysler.
yep.
And I saw, like, at the time when he had a job that was supported, it hadn't been to be a union shop, like how people thrived. I also watched when those jobs left. And my own personal story around that was I never wanted to be in a place where a job could be taken away from me because I saw that with my grandfather. So,
Mm,
I was that type A, tried to get, keep my skills up. I was moving forward in the workplace and I was working hard as I could. I was the person who got in before my boss, who left after, was doing all the extra things. And in the midst of that, I literally had a crash and that was a car crash. And I write about it in the book. And in the book, I was working for Nokia at the time, and I had flown to LA for a day.
hmm.
I got there at 5. I was going to leave the next day at 1, and I was driving to my meeting that morning, and my head was all the way towards what I was going to do, in the coming week. I had to get back to New York, drop things off so I could go to Europe. I was so busy, and in the
Mm,
instant, it all stopped. Right, so I made a right turn late because I thought I was about to miss my turn. Unbeknownst to me, there was a car coming up beside me, and I totaled the car. And the accident was
mm,
really my fault because I wasn't being present. I was already thinking about what I was going to do, 5 days from now. And it made me realize in that moment, how my life centered around work. And I thought to myself in that moment, I could have died. I hadn't seen,
hmm.
my grandparents who raised me, my family. I was single, living in New York. I had all these things, but they all revolved around work. And when I think about my personal life, it really wasn't there. And so that started the kind of inkling of this question of like, how do we think about work? How can we do work differently?
Wow. So were you hurt during the accident or were you okay?
I was hurt. So I went, fast forward 6 months in physical therapy, being off from work. I returned to work,
Hmm.
and the doctor I remember told me, he goes, Angela, if you can go back to work. I'm writing you a note. You're cleared to go back. He was like, but, try to keep the stress down. And I was like, okay, try to keep the stress down. And I remember that
That's
first
like
day I went in.
impossible though. That's like, thanks.
Thanks. Right. And I just remember those words because when the stress happens, and it still happens to this day, like the impact happened on my left hand side and like I can just tense up and feel it. So I go back and I remember sitting at my desk at Nokia and there was piles and piles of paper. And I went in with the head of the department, who was my partner. I was like, okay, bring me up to speed. What have you guys done since I've been out? And they were like, nothing. We were waiting for you to get back. I was like, wait, nothing's been
Uh-uh.
done in like 6 months. Like I just felt the stress and I heard the doctor's voice. And, I went in and I tried to talk to, my senior, people about, my condition. And of course they were going to make any accommodation that I wanted to have. But like, how do you accommodate grind culture, right? Where people are
Hmm.
working 12, 15-hour days. Like what do you do, right? And the management wasn't changing that. And so it came to a crossroads where I had to decide, okay, do I continue down this path or do I take a pause and you really try to get my health back together? And I decided like I was going to take a pause. I took a sabbatical. Nokia gives sabbaticals, took a year off to really think about like how I wanted to, what work and impact I wanted to have in the world and how I wanted that to feel.
Wow. And then I know we're going to get into your book and all of the work you've done since then, but did you end up, like, spoiler alert, did you end up saying, I don't want to go back to Nokia after that? And then you kind of spun off and started doing your own work?
That's exactly what happened. I actually took a sabbatical year in France, through caution to the wind, and said, okay, what like the irresponsible Angela do? What would be her heart's desire? I was the
I love
Angela
it.
that saved all the money. When we think about women at work, we do all the responsible things. But I was like, okay, you could have died. You're living. What are you going to do this year to like find out what your next step is? And so rented a small apartment, learned French, took journalism classes in French, and really thought about the impact I wanted to have in the world and the way that I wanted to work. And spoiler alert, like you said, I didn't end up going back to Nokia, but I ended up starting my own venture, which I ran for 8 years. And one thing about it, and I write about this in the book, The Win-Win Workplace, I had the opportunity, I realized, in founding this company to create the world of work and the workplaces I wished I would have had. And those were a bit
Mm,
more centered. And so I like very strategically and intentionally try to do things different because I thought if I created the workplace I just come from, I might as well just stay there. Being a founder is hard. But if I was
yes.
going to create something different, almost as an experiment with myself, what would that look like for me? And what would that look like for the others who work with me and for me?
Mm. Okay, so yes, I am all in. You've got me here. France. I lived in France when I was and I do not know French, so please don't break into it for me. But I lived there as a senior in college, so like we have a lot in common. So why don't you tell us, you said win-win workplace, right? So what does that mean to you? Because, it's a jargony term, like it's a win-win, right? So people could probably get lost on that, but I want to hear what the definition is for you.
Yeah, the biggest thing I've seen in the world of work is that it's this like narrative around zero sum, right? Like there has to be losers and winners. And like far too long, when we think about the workplace, it's been about, people being used as tools, objects, the end goal is profit and profitability. And, we'll
Hmm.
do that by hiring people, we'll do it by laying off people, we'll do it by overworking people by any means necessary. And what I set to really prove in my research is that how can it be a true win-win where people are thriving but also productive, and because they're productive that helps the bottom line. So really moving away from that, people are, expenses, we don't really need to invest in them, we can optimize. And this short-term thinking that we see, in public companies a lot because of the stock markets, and we see it in others because, people are chasing profits. And so I want to flip it, and I asked the question with my set of researchers are, what would it look like if there was a win-win? And literally, we went out and searched for these examples of where people were thriving and then the business itself had outsized returns.
Mm. And do you think sometimes like people would think it's a cliche, like win-win, because it's an overused term in corporate, but you actually found examples of true win-wins, correct?
Absolutely. So we started this research in 2019, 2020. It
Okay.
had happened right after the pandemic. There were lots of people that lost their jobs. I was leading a $50 million initiative that was invested in training 25,000 people who had lost their jobs due to COVID
Wow.
to get them into new jobs. And then what I did with my research team afterward is 6 months later, after people were placed in their jobs, we went in to check on them. So, how are things going? How's this new role? And it was funny. We found two things. Found one group, they were thriving, they're talking about like this is the best thing that ever happened to them, that they had to change careers. And then we saw another group where we went back and some of them had already left in less than six
Wow.
months. And so I really got curious about the difference because the people were very similar in their types, all laid off, all, had family obligations, needed to make a paycheck and make this career transition really quickly. One thing I saw, and this was heading towards COVID, and this is 2021, 2022, is we saw a set of practices and principles that where the people were thriving over and over again, we kept seeing the same thing. And those became the pillars of the book. We kept seeing that these places, what you could call win-win workplaces, they were really centering people's voice. So beyond some of the performative, you know, surveys or metrics, but really
Yes.
trying to understand from people a couple of things. What are your barriers to work? And then two, what ideas that people have at all level to make the business better. And I was fascinated by that with these companies on how they were able to do that. And I'll give you an example. I write about this in chapter 1 of the book around centering worker voice, but there was one company that went in, new management bought an underperforming company. They go in, it's called CHI Doors. It's actually in Illinois,
Huh.
in the southern part of Illinois. And what they went in and said, look, we're new management. We want to turn this company around. We plan to own it, 5 to 6 years. If we turn it around, if we can sell it for a profit, you'll all share in the profit. And
Cool.
so they began listening to all of the employees. And I spoke to one driver, and it was funny. He goes, I was like, well, what did that look like for you? What did that listening look like? And he goes, well, I've been driving this route for over 10 years working for this company. Like, the route is wrong. I grew up here. I know the shorter way and better way to do it. But the company keeps giving me this like GPS map. And he goes, and it was wrong. And I think, Jen, you and I can agree, like, and most of your listeners, we've had the instance where GPS has been wrong or
Yeah.
taking us the long, right? Not a shortcut, but a long cut.
Yeah.
And so the company not only listened to him on this idea around this route he gave them, he goes, I know how it can save you money. You can change the route. They actually interviewed all of the drivers, and they looked at all of their routes. And what they found was this driver particularly was right. And so by optimizing the routes, they were able to save the drivers time. They were able to increase on-time deliveries. And I thought most importantly, they were able to unlock someone in the company who was willing to like give their expertise and advice on how to build a company. So the company saved money, the workers saved frustration, but it set in like into start this policy of like really listening to their employees. And that helped with the bottom line. So again, it helped the employee, but it also really helped the business. And that's what the win-win is about. Like, how do you tap the genius of the people that you've hired? Because you've hired them because they're good, and really use them to unlock, right, profitability, to unlock cost savings, and really do that in a more methodical way, and that we haven't seen done in some of the other jobs. Some of the other jobs, I'll give you an example as a contrast. It's just like, come in, put your head down. We brought you in to do this one thing, and that's what we
Yep.
want you to do, and that's what you're paid for. And what we saw in the win-win workplace and strategy was like there was a missed opportunity in that.
Mm. So, okay, this has got me like my interest peaked, but I want to mention number one, this is a New York Times best-selling book. So congratulations. I don't know if anybody understands like how big of like a mountain that is to climb, but that is amazing. So congratulations. And the title of the full title for the book is The Win-Win Workplace: How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Results. So again, congratulations to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that. I think with the New York Times, and it also hit LA Times and
Oh,
USA
wow.
Today. And I say that because, yes, I wrote the book, but I think what I'm telling from it, and I went on a tour, I've been to 18 different cities, and I'm just talking to everyday folks and people, women who are just trying to do their careers, right? And the thing
Hmm.
that I'm hearing from them directly, because I always ask, what made you come to this book signing? What interests you about the book? And I think the people that I've talked to are just like many of us. Work takes up a third of our lives, even more so if we look at our waking hours, and
Yep.
really thinking about the small things that a company can do to help someone engage in work that not only benefits that person, but also benefits the company. And it's really important that we make clear this economic case and value case of benefiting the company. The reason why is it makes any initiative that's put forward or strategy sustainable. Because if you have a CFO who decides, this should be taken away, but they see that this is actually driving retention, right? It's helping with turnover, it's helping with productivity, they're more apt to keep that. And that's what we want. We don't want just, initiatives for initiative's sake or performative gestures. We really want business to understand by making these strategic investments in people, it keeps their business running.
So again, this is where the curiosity is peaked. And I've been in organizations where the I don't want to say bottom line, but the worker bee, right? The non-manager is just kind of put in this silo of this is what you do. You put this peg into this hole or work pound this widget or do this task. But they're not asked for their opinion because management is afraid of too many cooks in the kitchen. And I'd love your thoughts on this, but I think they're the ones often that have the answer that we can tap into and make them feel like they're on the same side of the table as us as we're leading or as we're in management. What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I feel like the day-to-day workers, right, entry level and above, they are the canary in the coal mine. They
Yes.
are on the front lines. They see the small things, right? They are the customers. They're shopping at the local store and hearing. They're going to their school's PTA meetings, and they're really underutilized. And that's because that's the traditional model of work. Like that we spend, 80% of our professional development dollars on our highest wage earners, and everybody else gets, safety training. We haven't really looked at, entry level middle management as an asset. And what I argue in the book is that the reason is that we really not train people to unlock that talent. And so there's a chapter in
Mm.
the book I talk about taking frontline managers and transitioning them to frontline leaders. And the reason why we need that is because they need to understand how to unlock the people who report to them. They're not just being bosses, they're not just being supervisor, but how do you actually cultivate the information, the ownership mindset that can help these people, again, unlock new ideas, new products, new services. And again, it's all in the spirit of doing it right to drive productivity, to drive the business growth. And so you have everyone working in concert versus a set of your company seeing as disposable.
Mm. Or doing so this also will help as I'm hearing it, and then I want to talk about top-down decision making because I think it goes part and parcel, is that it almost unlocks them to be strategic, to them not to be a time clock puncher, right? Or just clocking in and clocking out because they're part of a bigger vision. Is that correct?
That's exactly it. And that's the ideal state that we want to get to. And I write about it in the book, right? That we talk about, it's chapter 9, and thinking about how do you take and build an ownership mindset and culture. And when that, and I write about this CEO, Carrie Siggins at Stone Age, I mentioned with CHI that they, had profit sharing. And sometimes ownership is like giving someone a piece of the business. But
Yes.
sometimes it's what we saw in our research is really asking for their feedback and then acting on it. Not saying that you're able to do everything, but you are actively closing the loop. You're deeply considering what feedback you have. You're saying what you can do, what you can't do or can't do right now, and you're
Right.
sharing why. You're bringing people into the business. Unfortunately, that usually stops at middle management. Sometimes they don't even get it. And so, again, we're talking about a whole slew of people who we've not tapped their information. We haven't brought them in. And what we saw with these win-win workplaces that these people regularly felt bought in. They had a sense of ownership. So that driver, if you go back to him, he can tell you how much the company saved because the company circled back and they let him know that and congratulated him for giving his feedback. And that's what we're saying here is that there's a significant opportunity to give people agency, to have them more engaged, to have lower turnover by very simplistic, I call them investing in human type strategies you see in here. And a lot of times I was just talking to someone about the book and they said, these seem simple. And I was like, that's right. And I think that was my aha in writing this book is that these practices around listening and centering worker voice, thinking about how we relate to each other to like lessen the felt experience of hierarchies, right? How do we
Hmm.
reimagine benefits? And this is a big one for women in the workplace. We have a set of benefits that was like created for, someone down the line who was obviously not a woman, right? Because
Yes, that's correct.
benefits are 401k, you get a reimbursement for maybe if you go to the gym and you get some health care. Let's talk about what real people need today. And that's the thing I saw in some of these win-win workplaces. They were thinking about childcare. Some of them were building childcare centers best in class on the workplace premise. There's one company I talk about, Guild, when people were bleeding their women at all levels, women 6 figures had to drop out of the workplace because they didn't have stable, caregiving.
Yes.
They were able to retain upwards of 95% of their women. And the ones that left because they wanted to leave and it was other
Wow.
family matters. But these are and the daycare center, this is great about it. It paid for itself. So those who pay more pay more. Those who pay less, it's a sliding scale. But when you interview women from the front line to the C-suite, it's one of the most important benefits. One woman told me, she was like, I said, well, why do you stay here? She goes, nothing beats being able to go downstairs and just see my child for 30 seconds and make sure that they're okay and see them laughing and then go
That's
back up to my
absolutely true.
office.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. So I guess the question is, I've been thinking about this and now I'm really glad that you've put this book into the world and you've given, I don't know, like the how-to behind how to have a win-win workplace. But at one point, top-down decision making, the autocratic way, worked. Maybe it's generational. And I recently had someone that studies generations on, but like it's no longer working. Why is it no longer working?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. There's a huge disconnect, and more than ever, and we see this on the news, the lived experience of people who are in the C-suite is so vastly different than
Yeah.
everybody else. So there's this huge like live reality issue that we have going on. And then you have a few people who are still holding to that whole old guard, right? And you see people are like blanket, you must be come back to the office because I said so, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
that worked for a while, and we had a social contract around that. I think about my grandfather's days, right? He had a pension, he had retirement, he had the union. Why that doesn't work today is that we don't have any of that. Right. And so the idea that if you go in, right, and if you think about, I work really hard for you, I do all the things, that means I can still be laid off, and when there's a reduction in force a year later or 2 years later without any explanation. And then you'll leave with, the severance, I think
It's
that's good,
true.
2 weeks, a year. And so that doesn't work anymore because people are looking at that's number one, different motivations. The second thing that we've seen with our surveys of workers throughout the country is the pandemic happened. And after the pandemic, people are like, okay, what is this all about? And so you see more and more people who are willing to take cuts in their pay, willing to work differently, to have autonomy, to spend more time with family, and to have more agency. There was a survey that recently came out, it was 2 months ago, that 60% of people said that they'd be willing to take a pay cut if they could work remotely. And so when you start thinking about those motivations, the check itself doesn't have the power it used to because it doesn't have the supports that it used to. So now in this world of the gig economy, everyone's out for themselves. We're all free agents, flipping jobs every 2 years. Employers really have to think about what is your value proposition for someone coming in? And when we saw these win-win workplaces, they had it down about what their value proposition was and how they were going to attract people. And I'll give you an example of this. This was last year, Spotify, as Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan Chase was, making people come back into work. Spotify put up a billboard in Times Square and was like, we let our people work remote because we hire adults. And it said that in substance. And I thought,
That's
it's
awesome.
funny, right? But it's funny, but when you
It's
think
true
about it,
though,
it's
actually.
true. And that's the thing. And that's why they put it there because they knew that a lot of people right next to JP Morgan's office are going to be thinking about, do I want to go there all day? Would I like some more flexibility? So it's prime time for these win-win companies to actually poach talent from these old kind of traditionalists who want to be like inflexible. And we're seeing that happen more and more.
Okay, so I am in the financial services industry, right? I've worked in the financial services industry, so a little more traditional. I do not affiliate with Chase. So, but I mean, they were the first one, I think one of the first ones to like pull people back to the office. And I heard that there was backlash, kind of through the vibes there. But there are industries that are still doing it, right? Like financial services. So do you think we are going to have that kind of push pull where some industries are going to be more progressive and be more win-win and some are going to be more of that old guard and try to pull the opposite direction?
Well, absolutely. And when I say win-win, I just want to be really clear because, like you said, sometimes it can be seen as a cliche. We're saying that this is good for business, right?
Yes.
And even financial firms, if you see the new ones that are being built overnight in crypto and other industries, they're having their people work remote, right? They get this idea of benefits of engagement. And so this is where there's going to be kind of a foot race. Those who are lean and open are going to get the A players. And we always have to remember A players have optionality even in a tight job market. Two,
Yes.
and those are going to be your innovators that they're going to poach from a JP Morgan, Chase, and others because they're giving them the flexibility. They're investing in them as people. They're showing growth
Mm.
pathways. These are just the basics that unfortunately in our world of work haven't been like table stakes. And what we're seeing now is that the companies that are making them table stakes, that they're actually investing and treating people like humans, that they're winning. That, in the book we show they have higher stock price, they're having higher margins, right? They have increased productivity. Like, this isn't soft and gooey. These are real hard numbers that people are achieving by applying these strategies.
Mm. Okay, so that makes me excited, right? That like what you're saying is they can go back the way that they want to go back to the old guard, but they may lose on top talent, is what I'm hearing, is that this generation isn't going to tolerate, like maybe I'm a Gen X or, of course, my family and my boomer, parents, they would probably just kind of go and do what they were told. It sounds like no, like our top talent is going to go to the other side of these more win-win workplaces, which at the end of the day drive bottom line results.
Absolutely. And I think second, even if you talk about, performing talents, forget top, let's say, those who are doing good work, this generation, they also talk. They share salaries, right? There's more
Yes.
transparency with peers and colleagues. That means that raises the bar for any employer, right? So if you're giving someone a raise and someone else is talking about their salary, everyone's going to know. So if you've not really had been thoughtful about your benefits, how you're investing in people, the word gets around, not only with your employees, but also with your customers. And we're seeing a lot like that too. So this generation, when you survey Gen X, Gen Z, they care deeply about how a company shows up in the world, for the environment, for its people, its record. And so I think employers who are thinking about this win-win, they can use this to their benefit. I don't think about the people who will lose people. And some people ask me, they'll say to me, Jen, well, what about, insert Amazon, or, you're always going to have some bad actors, but I feel
Yes.
like they're at risk, real risk of being put out of business or right sized by some new actors that come up. And we've seen this throughout history. If you look at kind of disruption theory, you'll see that there's been, somebody who's king on the hill. They've been doing all things. They're refusing to innovate. They're using their old playbook, and then time passes them. I told you I worked for Viacom. I was sitting
Hmm.
there, I was working on the MTV brand when iTunes came out.
Oh,
And I have to tell you, a colleague of mine who sat next to me, Jason, he came up with the idea of MTV online music. And the company at the time, management was like, that's too much money in R&D that we'd have to invest in that. We're fine. And they were fine. They were fine in the moment. But like 3 years later, everyone in my company, everyone at MTV on that floor had an iPod. So when you think about the missed opportunity, and that's what I'm talking about in this book, how do you unlock and center worker voices? How do you use that to really inform the strategy? And how are we investing in the people who make these ideas happen, right? From top to bottom. And so that's the new way of thinking about it. And again, I just think that these people who are thinking differently are going to be better positioned.
okay. So let's go in like the one direction, so where we're going wrong, and then we're going to pendulum swing the opposite and like what we need to do to go right, right? Of course, we've got
Perfect.
to leverage the book. So where are leaders, like where are we going wrong with employee engagement, company and leadership? Where are we going wrong?
So the first is these annual surveys. I was just with a group last week, and their the leader said to me, we just had an employee engagement survey. I was like, oh great. How often do you have those? She goes, once a year. And so I looked at the audience. I was like, you all participated. They raised their hands, and I said, well, who's heard back from the feedback on what's going to change? Everybody dropped their hand except 7 people. We had about 90 people in the room. And so
Wow.
that's where we go wrong. We ask lots of questions. I mean, employee listening is a $1 billion business. But do we actually, when I say close the loop and act on the feedback we've heard and actually gone back to someone like they're a human and actually said, you've spent your hour doing this. Here's what we found out. And this is what we're going to do about it. Or here's what we're thinking about it. That makes all the difference. And it's so easy to do, especially, and I tell people with generative AI to take lots of research, to do data analytics, to give it to frontline managers so they can actually make changes and
Mm,
impact. So that's just table stakes. So that's what they're
hmm.
doing wrong. The second big thing that they're doing wrong is assuming they know what their employees want and what matters to their employees. Um, we've had this society where we think, okay, we give them this salary, give them this benefit, right? Like that's what they want and that's what they need. We're missing a lot of intangibles. we are in a 5 generation workplace right now. When I
Hmm.
talk to a lot, I'm Gen X right now. When I talk to a lot of my colleagues, they've got, children that they are parenting or who are in college. They also have their elders, their parents that they're caring for who are living longer. And so the needs that I have today, if I'm in that situation and I'm a woman, might be different, right, than somebody who's single. And how are we really thinking about that, saying it's not just her problem, it's our problem workplace because we're 55% women. And so
Hmm.
really thinking reimagining benefits from that front. The second thing that we hear are from millennials and Gen Z. They're when they start for a job, they say, "Oh my God, it's great that someone has 401k," but they're like, "We've got unprecedented college loans." And so what we've seen, for example, and really listening that, old workplace, what we did wrong was if someone has some financial burdens, that's their problem to figure it out. We gave you a paycheck. You worked 8 hours, we gave you a
Yes.
paycheck. What we're seeing now and doing differently is saying if that person's having financial issues, that means that they're probably thinking about them when they come to work. Is there something at work that we can do once we know that this might be an issue to help people in that situation? So we're having, companies that are giving financial planners, doing financial literacy. We have
Hmm.
some that are giving student loan payment assistance, some that are
Hmm.
giving down payment assistance, not for just houses, but also for apartments so people can live in the area. These are like the
Wow.
transformational things that we're seeing companies do. And then when we go back and we'll survey their employees and say, okay, we ask that proverbial, do you feel like your employer cares about you? Some of them say yes. And then we say, how? These are the examples of the benefits that they say that they actually feel that this is how they know the company actually cares about them. And so that's why I said what companies get wrong is that you could really use this as a tool with coupled with listening to find out what someone really needs, what your workplace really needs. You can give them that. And you can have, in that instance, someone who's more engaged, feel seen, right? And feel cared for by their employer.
Okay, so a couple things come up here, right? Being a little on the older side of, the Gen X and that spectrum. So the first thing I have heard in prior places I've worked at is the sense of fairness. And that makes me insane because I'm like, not every benefit is going to fit everybody's situation. So let's say work from home or like a childcare situation. Well, someone might complain that is single and doesn't have kids. Well, you know what? How come they get this extra benefit and I don't get that? So how do you deal with the sense of, being unfair or not equal in some of these benefits?
So one is when I think about it, I always, when we're talking to our clients, and we saw this through the companies, we need to think about what are the benefits that allow people to actually engage in work, to show up. These are basic.
Yes,
And so when you do that and you're centering listening, you can actually strategically say, you know, 80% of our people here are parents. And this is why we're focused on childcare in
got
this
it.
moment and caregiving. So you're actually using with a data position. We're doing student loan payment because we've surveyed and we know that, 70% of our people are still paying off student loans. That's why we're offering this, right? And you have this commitment. And again, a company can't do everything. You will have some people who are not, but we've seen when they've come in with the centering voice and having data from that that informs their strategy and bring people in, people get it. Even if the benefit doesn't benefit them, they're like, oh, but XYZ does. And there is going to be something. And that's what we say to employers. Make sure if you're looking at 5 generations, you've got a benefit that's touched all of them, right? That they can
Got
find
it.
themselves in.
Yeah, but you also said something critical like close the loop rather than just like management going off to the side and making a key benefit decision and the staff doesn't understand it, right? And they're just inheriting the decision. That's that engaged conversation with the employees so they understand why the decisions are being made.
That's exactly it. And even why these benefits are being presented to them. How many times you sign up and you get a benefits package? They're like, okay, welcome to the company. These are your benefits. Pick what you want. And you're like, okay, of this, I'll pick this and that. Like, no one's told me like why these benefits. I mean, and the problem is too, and I say to bosses and employers and managers, the risk we have in not explaining what we do and why we do it is that people miss the value. And I just
Hmm.
want to say that again.
Yes.
We give people opportunities and things that we call benefits. We don't explain them and we assume that they're going to find value in them. I had I'll tell you a story of a fast casual restaurant. The man who was the CEO, he had offered all of his frontline employees for the first time 501 that they could 401k that they could contribute,
Yes.
given a match. And they brought me in because they wanted to know why people weren't taking part of it. And so I was like, okay, let's go back to principle one. Let's do some listening. And what we found out was like people appreciated the benefit, but they had other pressing things. People talked about, their kids were getting ready to go to college. They talked about wanting to buy a new house. And so what we heard from them is that 401k seemed, retirement seemed a long ways off. What they needed was access to resources today. And to the CEO's credit, he did that. And what we were able to do is that engagement score went up by 40%. When you had, again, that score of, are you the stay interviews that we do? People want to stay. They mentioned these types of benefits. They mentioned having choice. And I think if all of our listeners are here, day to day, month to month, year to year, your situation changes. And what matters to you in that year may be different. I think about the
Mm-hmm.
year I was caregiving for my grandmother. Before that, I was flying fancy free, no kids, jet setting to
Mm.
Europe and to LA, living in New York. And then literally in one year, when that became a thing, I was looking for all support. And I tell you, I've seen certain companies here who are really meeting this moment, thinking about, subgroups, ERG groups around, caregiving and families, just so we make sure that our employees through their phases of life, right, don't feel like they're alone, that they can be supported.
So this goes down in I wrote it down in one of the questions to the idea of psychological safety, right? So I've been in organizations where the employees may not speak up because maybe they don't feel safe to speak up or give that feedback or think they're not going to be listened to. So if you're in a situation like that, how can an employer create that safety or reaffirm or reestablish it so that employees feel like talking so that they understand what they need to, thrive?
And let's just also acknowledge they have a right to feel that way. We've seen the history. I'll go back to
Yeah.
JP Morgan Chase. A few months ago, you had, Jamie Dimon at a town hall meeting. Someone stood up and questioned about the work from home policy. And Jamie, admittedly said, he had a bad day. So he went totally off. The person sat down, went back to their office, and their direct manager said, you should go home, and basically fired him. Jamie didn't tell that person to fire them, but what I call that instance is a zero sum workplace, right? The zero sum workplace, you have a town hall, you invite people to come in to ask questions, to share their thoughts, but none that will bother you or ruffle any feathers. And God
Right.
forbid if you do in a zero sum workplace, you get fired. You're shown the door. That's how it works. And unfortunately, many of us have grown up in those workplaces. And so the idea of psychological safety, so that you are really going to open up, when you say centering worker voice, you have to earn in and make sure that you're closing the loop so people feel comfortable telling you hard truths or asking questions that they really have on their mind that you may need to hear and grapple with as a team. All of the things aren't going to be great. I had a CEO, it's everything's about this. She was telling me that, she had a town hall virtual with all of her people and she turned the chat off. And she said she wanted people to really ask direct questions to her. They didn't want to do any anonymous questions. And she goes, the first time the questions were a little bit, but over time, she said she was building psychological safety. She had taken over from another leader. She was like 9 months in, she was like, it went from very few questions to a lots of them, because what she tried to do in the moment is that when people were brave and asked tough questions, she tried to thank them for it. She answered
Mm-hmm.
it and leaned
Mm-hmm.
in. And that's what builds that psychological safety, right? Because a lot of us, again, have that trauma from some of these zero sum workplaces.
Mm-hmm. So a question that goes into like resistance to change, right? So let's say you have a leader that is all about building psychological safety, but you have residual leaders or old guard or people resistant to change on the management team as well. I'm hearing, this is more of a comment that I want you to react to. I'm hearing that you get kind of a mixed result then because you can't entirely be psychological safe unless everyone is rowing in the same direction strategically to create that environment. Is that accurate?
That's completely accurate. And in those cases, you have to have a reset.
Yeah.
And I was working with a firm. It's a global firm. I can't name their name, but they had this very problem with their managers. They had, a third that were knocking out of the park, a middle that was like kind of, doing all the things, and a third that was underperforming based on
Yes.
assets they had under management. And one thing that they realized, which a lot of us know, is that these managers hadn't been trained. And most managers aren't. Most of us are promoted into management because we're a great individual contributor, not because we're a great people person or around
Yes.
psychological safety. Like, do we even know these terms and what they mean? And what do they mean for this workplace? And so, one of the big pieces of advice I have to do is onboarding managers. That's managers who are promoted from within, that's managers from coming from without. What does it mean to be a manager at Brave Women at Work? What does that culture
Yes.
mean? How do we invest in people? How do we train them? What is psychological safety? Why do we think it's critical to our business? When this company did this, they had a turnaround. So, of that bottom third that were underperforming, two-thirds of them went up to performing or higher. One-third of them did leave. And so, I'm not saying that this is a magic wand. What they noticed in those people leaving is that everyone wasn't built to be a manager. And the
Hmm.
challenge, and no, not everyone wants to be a manager, is what we found out too. When we did exit interviews, people were like, well, I just wanted to be promoted. Like, I didn't want to take on all of this responsibility with people.
Hmm.
That's important too, because in the zero sum, it's like the only way to get promoted is you're promoted to management. Can we be creative and think about other ways that we can bring people along? And that's what we saw in the win-win workplace. People are thinking about, we're promoting people and the managers who understand the job. We've trained them about what a manager is to be here in this company. And then others, we find other ways to bring them in, and other ways that they will grow within the organization.
Okay, so I heard many things here in that list, but is there anything else that organizations can do to empower their employees to like make those decisions that are going to drive growth, they're going to drive ownership, that ownership mentality? Is there anything else that in the book that we need to mention here?
No, I think the big thing is really I'm just going to double down on the listening and the data and
Okay.
using that to really drive your decisions. It will drive your insights. It will help you with your talking points as you decide how you want to move forward. Anchor in that and centering people and what they've said and what they've said they want.
You know what? And I'm going to give myself a little pat on the back here right now. I'm in a situation that I'm driving cultural change.
Mm,
And that's, instinctively, that was the first thing I did is I sat with every individual person and just asked them, like, what's up? Like, how are you? What's working? What's that? Just human to human conversation. And it was amazing what I heard
mm,
and reported back, and I said, well, we got to go do that, and then I have to put my money where my mouth is, and I have a lot longer of a road to go to show them the changes, right? But I feel like that's what I'm doing is I'm closing the loop over and over and over again. So if we have a trust jar between us, I'm putting my piece of the trust jar in, and now it's on them. And I told them in the conversation, I said, hey folks, I'm going to the 50-yard line. Are you meeting me there? Because I'm putting my coin in the trust bank. What are you doing? So I feel
yeah.
like I'm like walking your talk. I'm so excited.
It's such a beautiful analogy, Jen, that you just shared that, we're earning in, you know, in that zero sum workplace, it was like, I'm the boss, you just trust me. You know,
Yeah, no, it doesn't work.
it doesn't work. We're earning in decision by decision, right? And we're building towards this future. But the idea is leaders, and sometimes, as women, I think we're better at that, but sometimes we get at fault at this, is that we think we have to do it all by ourselves. And
Yes.
what I'm saying is that's the old world of work, right? Where you got to set people of people, finite, the management team that knows all. They're the intellectuals, they're the innovators. That's gone. We can't afford, especially in this market, to have people who are sitting in our companies who are feeling like they're underused or untapped. Like that's that lose scenario. We can bring people in, we can ask them how to grow the company, we can bring them into our thinking, and that
Hmm.
way we don't feel like we have this kind of S on our chest, right? And we're in a cape in the back thinking that we have to do this ourselves. That ownership mindset, when employers have that, their companies are doing better. They just are. They're perceiving less burnout because there's that culture of a team, and we're all, to your point, rowing in the same boat, right? We're all meeting at the 50-yard line, which means we don't have to do the 100 all by ourselves, right? Because that would exhaust us.
Yeah, no, I've tried that. That doesn't work. I've already tried that game, everybody. That doesn't work for me. Okay, so what do you believe now that we've talked about workplaces as a whole? Now let's go to women specifically. What are 1 to 2 ways that you believe women can be braver at work today?
The biggest thing we can do is trust our intuition.
Mm,
And a lot of times we lead differently than men. And I'm on boards now and public boards, and we go in, and there's this probably tendency that we want to be like one of the guys, right?
hmm
Um, I think our superpower is being us and bringing a different flavor into the
mm,
board, into how we lead in the management. And so I'd say to women leaders out there, trust your intuition about how you should be showing up because
hmm
they're already there, right? We've got 8 of them and we've got 1 of you. What can you bring that's uniquely yours and actually trust that to move forward? I think is number one. Then
hmm
the second thing that we can do as women when we're in these places is we can help lift up other voices. A lot of times when you have one woman that speaks, right, we can have other, that enables other women to speak. So really thinking about how we use our voice to actually open doors, right, for other people who are coming in, and also using our voice, right, to encourage others to use theirs.
Okay, I love that. I love it. And I love just like it's kind of like echoing off of me, like the idea of psychological safety. I'll throw that in. It's like creating spaces for other women to be psychologically safe to use their voice and to share, all of those things. So thank you for bringing that into kind of my purview. Where can women connect with you? We're going to say the book again, The Win-Win Workplace, How Thriving Employees Drive Bottom Line Results. So where can women connect with you and your work online?
Yeah, 2 ways. So one, read winwinworkplace.com. And then
Mm-hmm.
the second thing, would love for them to link in with me. We do each year called the Win-Win Workplace Summit, and we're planning for next year. And this is where we bring heart-centered leaders together, right, to talk about how they're implementing these and how it's actually working to drive results for the business. And so would love to be in community with any of your listeners.
Okay, great. So we will put everything in the show notes. And Angela, it is so evident you are passionate about creating as many win-win workplaces as possible. And I hope that you do because I think that our nation, our world would be a better place for it.
Jen, thank you. I received that. And I'd love to report back to you. And we'll be coming back to Illinois soon. So we'll get to see each other in person.
Well, that does it for my discussion with Dr. Angela today. I hope you found our conversation both valuable and inspiring. As a reminder, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast in Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The show is also available on any other podcast platform you enjoy. Until next time, show up, go for the win-win, and be brave.